On the night of December 6, 1959, in the wealthy Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, Dr. Harold Perelson walked through his home with a ball-peen hammer in his hand. The house was quiet. His wife Lillian was asleep in their bed, unaware. His daughter Judy, 18 years old, was in her room, likely dreaming of college or Christmas or whatever ordinary things 18-year-old girls dreamed about in 1959. His younger daughter Debbie, 11, was down the hall. The youngest child was asleep as well. It was a Saturday night, turning into Sunday morning. The kind of night when nothing is supposed to happen. It's the kind of night when families sleep safely in their beds, trusting that the walls around them will hold. But Harold Perelson had stopped trusting anything. He had stopped sleeping. He had stopped functioning in the way a man is supposed to function when he has a wife and children, and a career, and a mortgage, and a reputation to maintain. Something inside him had fractured, quietly, over weeks or months or perhaps years, in a way that no one around him had fully recognized. And on this particular night, that fracture became a break. He made a decision. He picked up a hammer. He walked through his home in the dark. The first scream came from the master bedroom. Lillian Perelson woke to the impact of metal against her skull. She had no time to process what was happening, no time to ask why or plead or fight back. The blows were immediate and brutal. Harold struck her repeatedly, with the kind of force that suggested not rage, exactly, but determination. A commitment to finishing what he had started. Lillian died in her bed. She was 42 years old. She had been married to Harold for nearly 2 decades. She had raised 3 children with him. She had built a life with him. And in the space of a few minutes, that life ended. Harold did not stop. He moved through the house with purpose, as if following a plan he had already rehearsed in his mind. He went to Judy's room next. She was asleep when he entered. The first blow woke her. She felt the hammer connect with her head, felt the explosion of pain and confusion, and in that moment she understood, with the terrible clarity that comes in life-or-death situations, that her father was trying to kill her. She screamed. She fought. She pushed him away with whatever strength adrenaline gave her, and somehow she survived. The blow had been severe, her skull fractured, blood pouring down her face, but she was conscious. She was alive, and she ran. Judy's screams woke her younger siblings. Debbie and their brother, disoriented and terrified, stumbled out of their rooms. Judy, bleeding and barely able to stand, grabbed them and pulled them toward the door. She did not stop to ask questions. She did not try to reason with her father. She understood in a way that only someone who has just been attacked by a parent can understand, that there was no reasoning left. There was only survival. The 3 children fled the house together, out into the cold December night, their bare feet on the pavement, their breath visible in the air. Judy collapsed on a neighbor's lawn, her head still bleeding, her younger siblings crying beside her. The neighbors, woken by the noise, came outside and saw what no one should ever have to see, children covered in blood. Shaking, unable to explain what had just happened, because the explanation was too monstrous to speak aloud. Inside the house, Harold Perelson did not chase them, did not try to finish what he had started. Instead, he returned to his own bedroom, the room where his wife's body now lay, and he made his final decision. He swallowed a bottle of Nimbutal, a barbiturate he had easy access to as a doctor. Also swallowed a solution of acid, perhaps to ensure that there would be no chance of survival, no possibility of waking up in a hospital, to face what he had done. He lay down on his bed, next to Lillian's body or near it, and he waited to die, and he did. By the time the police arrived, Harold Perelson was gone. He had taken himself out of the story he had just written, leaving behind only the aftermath. The police found the scene exactly as the children had described it. Lillian's body in the master bedroom, the murder weapon nearby, Harold's body in the same room, the evidence of his suicide clear. The house was otherwise undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the bedrooms, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been involved. This was not a home invasion. This was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. This was something else, something colder. The officers who processed the scene later described it as one of the most disturbing cases they had ever worked, not because of the violence itself, but because of the context. This was a wealthy family, a doctor, respected member of the community, a man who had sworn an oath to do no harm, Yet here he was, having committed the most intimate harm imaginable. The neighbors were interviewed. They described the Perelsons as quiet, private, unremarkable. No one had heard fighting. No one had seen warning signs. Harold had seemed tired, perhaps, in recent months, stressed. But who wasn't tired and stressed? This was Los Angeles in the 1950s. Everyone was building something, striving for something, holding together the image of the American dream, even when the reality was more complicated. Harold Perelson had seemed no different. He went to work. He came home. He provided for his family. He was polite. He was competent. He was normal. Right up until the moment he wasn't, there was no note. No letter explaining his reasoning or apologizing for his actions. No manifesto outlining grievances or delusions. Harold Perelson simply acted, and then he died, and the silence he left behind was absolute. The investigators searched for a motive. They looked into his finances and found that his medical practice was struggling. They interviewed colleagues and learned that he had seemed withdrawn. They spoke to family members who mentioned that Lillian had suggested he see a psychiatrist, though whether he ever did remains unclear. But none of these details added up to an explanation. Financial stress does not make a man kill his wife with a hammer. Depression does not make a father attack his children. There was something missing, some final piece that would make the story make sense, and that piece was gone. It had died with Harold Perelson. The children were taken to the hospital. Judy's injuries were severe but not fatal. She would recover physically, though the psychological wounds were something else entirely. Debbie and her brother were unharmed physically, but they had witnessed their sister covered in blood, fleeing from their father. They had lost their mother. They had lost their father, not just to death, but to the knowledge of what he had done. They had lost their home, their sense of safety, their understanding of the world as a place where parents protect their children rather than destroy them. They were placed with relatives. They were told to move forward. And they did, because children have no choice but to move forward. Harold Perelson had built a life that looked complete from the outside. He had a medical degree from a respected institution. He had a thriving practice, or what had once been a thriving practice, specializing in cardiology at a time when heart disease was becoming the leading cause of death in America. He had patients who trusted him. He had colleagues who respected his expertise. He had a beautiful Spanish-style mansion in Los Feliz, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Los Angeles, with views of the hills and enough space for a growing family. He had a wife who managed the household and raised the children. He had 3 children who were healthy and reasonably well-behaved. By every measure that mattered in 1959, Harold Perelson had succeeded. He had achieved what men of his generation were taught to achieve. He had built something solid. But solidity is not the same as stability. And somewhere beneath the surface of Harold Perelson's life, something had begun to crack. The exact moment when it started is impossible to pinpoint. Perhaps it was gradual, a slow erosion that took years. Perhaps it was sudden, triggered by a specific event or realization that no one else witnessed. What is known is that in the months before the murders, Harold Perelson began to change. The change was subtle at first. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He spent longer hours at his office, or claimed to, though some colleagues later suggested that he was not always seeing patients during those hours. He seemed distracted during conversations, as if his mind was elsewhere, working through problems that no one else could see. His medical practice, which had once been successful, was struggling. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. Some reports suggest that he had made poor financial decisions, that he had overextended himself or invested in ventures that failed. Others suggest that his patient base had simply declined. He was losing referrals to younger doctors or specialists with newer techniques. Whatever the cause, the financial pressure was real. Harold Perelson was a man who had built his identity around professional success, around being a provider, around the ability to maintain a certain standard of living for his family. And that standard was slipping. The house, the lifestyle, the image of prosperity, all of it required money. And the money was running out, Lillian noticed. She must have noticed. In the weeks before her death, she had reportedly suggested to Harold that he see a psychiatrist. This was not a casual suggestion. In 1959, seeking psychiatric help carried a stigma, especially for men, especially for professionals. To admit that you needed help with your mind, your emotions, your ability to cope, was to admit weakness. It was to risk your reputation. Lillian's suggestion then indicates that she saw something serious enough to warrant that risk. She saw her husband unraveling. She saw the exhaustion, the distance, the way he seemed to be carrying a weight that he would not share with her. Whether Harold took her suggestion seriously is unknown. There is no record of him seeking treatment. No therapist came forward after his death to say that they had been working with him. If he did see someone, he kept it entirely private. More likely, he refused. More likely, he could not admit, even to himself, that he needed help. Friends and colleagues who knew Harold during this period described him in careful, measured terms. They said he seemed burdened. They said he looked tired, as if he was not sleeping well. One colleague mentioned that Harold had seemed preoccupied during a lunch meeting, that he had been difficult to engage in conversation, that his responses were delayed and vague. But no one described him as violent. No one said he seemed dangerous. There were no outbursts, no threats, no moments of explosive anger that might have served as a warning. Harold Perelson kept whatever was happening inside him locked down. He maintained the facade. He continued to go through the motions of his life, even as the internal structure was collapsing. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story. Harold Perelson was not a man who had visibly lost control. He was not ranting in the streets or making wild accusations or exhibiting the kind of behavior that would prompt intervention. He was quiet. He was functional. He went to work. He came home, interacted with his family in ways that seemed, to the outside world, normal enough. The gap between his external presentation and his internal reality was so wide that no one could see across it. And this gap is not unique to Harold Perelson. It exists in countless lives, in the homes of people who seem fine, who seem to be managing, who give no indication that they are on the edge of something catastrophic. The difference is that most of the time that edge is not crossed. Most of the time people find a way to pull back, or they reach out for help, or the crisis passes. But sometimes it does not pass. Sometimes the weight becomes too much. The person who seemed fine, who seemed to be holding it together, suddenly is not. Harold Perelson was a cardiologist. He understood the human heart in mechanical terms. He knew how blood moved through chambers and valves. He knew what happened when an artery blocked, when pressure built, when the system failed. He had studied the body's vulnerabilities, its breaking points. But the mind is not the heart. The mind does not fail in ways that can be measured on an EKG or corrected with surgery. The mind breaks quietly, privately, in ways that even the person experiencing the break may not fully understand. Harold Perelson spent his career trying to prevent physical death, trying to keep hearts beating, trying to give his patients more time. And yet he could not diagnose or treat whatever was killing him from the inside. There is a photograph of the Perelson family taken some time before the murders. It is a formal portrait, the kind that families in the 1950s would have taken at a studio. Harold is seated, wearing a suit, his expression serious but not unkind. Lillian is beside him, her hair styled, her posture perfect. The children are arranged around them, dressed neatly, looking at the camera with the slight awkwardness that children always have in formal photographs. It is an image of stability. It is an image of success. It is an image that says, this is a family that has made it, that has achieved the dream. And yet within months of this photograph being taken, everyone in it would be dead or traumatized beyond repair. The photograph is a lie, but not because anyone in it was lying. It is a lie because photographs cannot capture what is happening beneath the surface. They cannot show the financial stress, the sleepless nights, the growing sense of panic, the thoughts that Harold Perelson was having but not sharing. They cannot show the moment when a man decides that he cannot continue, that the only way out is through destruction. The community around Harold Perelson saw him as a professional, a neighbor, a father. They did not see him as a threat. They did not see him as someone capable of violence. And this is the terrifying truth at the center of the story. Harold Perelson was not an outlier in the obvious sense. He was not a criminal with a history of violence. He was not mentally ill in a way that anyone recognized or diagnosed. He was a man who looked like he was managing right up until the moment he stopped managing entirely. And the collapse, when it came, was total. There was no middle ground, no cry for help, no opportunity for intervention. There was only the slow, invisible disintegration of a man's ability to cope, followed by a single night of irreversible action. Judy Perelson woke to the sound of her father's footsteps. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times before, a familiar weight of him moving through the house at night, perhaps going to the bathroom or getting a glass of water or checking on something before returning to bed. There was no reason to be alarmed, and then she heard something else. A presence in her doorway, shadow against the dim light from the hallway, and then the impact, metal against bone. The first blow landed before she fully understood what was happening. Her head exploded with pain. There was no time to process, no moment of gradual realization. 1 second she was asleep, safe in her own bed, in her own home, and the next second her father was trying to kill her. The human brain, in moments of extreme trauma, does strange things. It fragments, refuses to accept what is happening, even as the body responds with pure survival instinct. Judy later described in the few times she spoke about that night that her father's face was blank, not angry, not twisted with rage or grief or any emotion she could recognize, just blank, empty, as if he had already left his body, as if some other force was controlling his movements while the part of him that was her father had simply shut down. She saw the hammer. She understood what it meant, and she screamed. The scream was instinct. It was the body's refusal to die quietly. It was loud enough to wake the rest of the house, loud enough to penetrate the walls and reach her younger siblings, loud enough that neighbors 2 houses away would later tell police they heard it. Judy fought. She did not lie still. She did not accept what was happening. She pushed against him, threw her arms up to protect her head, rolled away from the next blow. Her skull had already been fractured. Blood was pouring down her face, into her eyes, her mouth. The pain was overwhelming, disorienting, but she stayed conscious. Some part of her understood that if she lost consciousness, she would die. So she fought. And somehow, impossibly, she created enough space between herself and her father to get out of the bed, to stumble toward the door, to run. Her younger siblings were awake now, terrified and confused. Debbie, 11 years old, had heard the screaming and come out of her room. Their younger brother was there too, crying, not understanding what was happening, but understanding that something was very wrong. Judy, barely able to see through the blood, grabbed them. She did not explain. There was no time to explain. She just pulled them toward the front door, away from their father, away from the house that had suddenly become a place where children were not safe. She did not go to her mother's room. She did not try to check on Lillian. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps some part of her understood that if her father had come for her with a hammer, he had already done something to her mother. Or perhaps she simply knew that survival meant moving forward, not back. The front door was unlocked. Judy pushed it open, and the 3 children spilled out into the night. It was December in Los Angeles, which meant it was cold by California standards, maybe in the 50s. And the children were barefoot, wearing whatever they had been sleeping in. Judy was still bleeding heavily. She made it across the lawn, across the street to a neighbor's house. She pounded on the door. She collapsed on the lawn. Debbie and her brother stood beside her, shaking, crying, not knowing what to do. When the neighbors opened the door and saw the children standing there, covered in blood, barefoot and trembling, they called the police immediately. They brought the children inside. They tried to comfort them, though what comfort could possibly be offered in that moment is impossible to say. Judy was taken to the hospital. Her injuries were severe. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. She needed immediate medical attention. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. The house behind them was quiet now. Harold Perelson did not follow his children out the door. He did not chase them down the street. Once they were gone, he stopped. He returned to the master bedroom where Lillian's body lay, and he made his final choice. The police would arrive within minutes, but by the time they entered the house, it was already over. Harold Perelson had taken himself out of the equation. He had removed the possibility of arrest, of trial, of explanation. He had ensured that there would be no interrogation, no courtroom testimony, no opportunity for anyone to ask him why. He left only silence. Perelson spent weeks in the hospital recovering from her physical injuries. The fractures healed. The bleeding stopped. The visible wounds closed. But the psychological damage was something else entirely. She had been attacked by her father. She had watched her family disintegrate in a single night. She had lost her mother. She had lost her father, not just to death, but to the knowledge of what he had done. She had nearly lost her own life, and she was 18 years old. She was supposed to be thinking about college, about her future, about boys and friends, and all the normal things that 18-year-olds think about. Instead, she was trying to figure out how to survive something that most people cannot even imagine. She never returned to the house. The Los Feliz mansion, the place where she had grown up, where she had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where she had felt safe until the moment she did not, became a place she could never go back to. The authorities handled the estate. Relatives took custody of the younger children. Jedi was legally an adult, but in every other sense, she was still a child herself, trying to process trauma that would take a lifetime to understand. She changed her name. This is a detail that is often overlooked, but it is significant. Jedi Perelson, the girl who survived that night, ceased to exist in any official capacity. She took on a new identity. She moved away from Los Angeles. She built a life elsewhere, with people who did not know her history, who did not ask questions about her family or her childhood. She erased herself as much as a person can be erased, because to remain Jedi Perelson was to remain the girl whose father tried to kill her, and that was not a survivable identity. She never spoke publicly about what happened, not in any detailed way. Occasionally over the years, journalists would find her, would try to interview her, would ask her to revisit that night for their stories, their documentaries, their investigations, and she would refuse. She understood something that most people do not understand until they have lived through trauma of that magnitude. Talking about it does not make it better. Reliving it for an audience does not bring closure. There is no closure. There is only the endless work of carrying something too heavy to carry and finding a way to live anyway. Jedi did that work in private. She protected herself in the only way she could, by refusing to be defined by what had happened to her. Her younger siblings were also marked by that night, though in different ways. They were younger. They did not see what Jedi saw. They did not feel the hammer. But they heard the screaming. They saw their sister covered in blood. They lost their parents. They lost their home, were separated, placed with different relatives, their childhoods fractured by a single act of violence that they had no power to prevent or understand. They grew up knowing that their father had killed their mother and tried to kill their sister. They grew up knowing that the man who was supposed to protect them had been the source of the greatest danger they would ever face. They had to find a way to build lives on top of that knowledge. The survival was physical, but the cost was total. Jedi Perelson ran out of that house and kept running, in one form or another, for the rest of her life. She saved herself and her siblings. She acted with extraordinary courage in a moment when most people would have frozen or given up. But courage does not erase trauma. Survival does not mean healing. It just means you are still here, still breathing, still trying to make sense of something that will never make sense. The mansion itself was abandoned almost immediately. After the police finished processing the crime scene, after the bodies were removed and the blood was documented and photographed, after the investigators had collected whatever evidence they thought might explain what had happened, the house was simply left. The Perelson family's belongings remained exactly where they had been on the night of December 6, 1959. Furniture sat in the same positions. Clothing hung in closets. Dishes were still in the kitchen cabinets. Books lined the shelves in the study. Family photographs remained on the walls and on tables, frozen images of a family that no longer existed. And in the living room beneath the Christmas tree, there were wrapped presents that would never be opened. The presents are perhaps the most haunting detail. They had been placed there in the days before the murders, wrapped carefully in festive paper, tagged with names, waiting for Christmas morning. Gifts for Lillian, for Judi, for Debbie, for the youngest child. Gifts from Harold to his family selected, and purchased at a time when he was already planning, consciously or unconsciously, to destroy them. Or perhaps he was not planning it at all. Perhaps the presents represent the last moment when Harold Perelson believed his family would have a future together, before something inside him finally broke completely. Either way, the presents remained under that tree for decades. They became artifacts of a moment that never arrived, evidence of a holiday that was supposed to happen, but did not. The estate was eventually transferred to relatives, but no one wanted to live there. This was not just a matter of superstition or discomfort, though those factors certainly played a role. It was also practical. The house was a crime scene. It was a place where a woman had been murdered and a man had committed suicide. It was a place that would forever be associated with that night, regardless of what anyone did to it. To live there would be to live inside the story of what Harold Perelson had done. To sleep in those bedrooms, to walk through those hallways. To sit in that living room would be to constantly inhabit the space where a family had been annihilated. So the relatives made a different choice. They sold it. The new owners, whoever they were, never moved in. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. Perhaps they bought it as an investment, intending to renovate and resell. Perhaps they moved in briefly and found it unbearable. Perhaps they simply could not bring themselves to occupy a space with that history. Whatever the reason, the house remained empty. And as the years passed, as the 1960s became the 1970s, and then the 1980s, the house began to deteriorate. The lawn grew wild. The exterior paint faded and peeled. Windows collected dust and grime. The Spanish-style architecture, once beautiful and well-maintained, started to look haunted, not because of any supernatural presence, but simply because of neglect. The house was dying slowly, the way abandoned buildings always die, through exposure and time and the absence of human care. But inside, remarkably, things remained largely untouched. The furniture was still there. The personal belongings were still there. Decades after the murders, people who managed to get inside the house reported seeing 1950s era clothing still hanging in closets. Medical journals from Harold's practice still stacked on shelves. Children's toys still scattered in bedrooms. It was as if the house had been sealed in time, preserved not intentionally, but through sheer abandonment. No one had bothered to clear it out. No one had packed up the Perelson family's life and distributed it or thrown it away. It simply remained, accumulating dust, slowly decaying, but still recognizable as the home of a family that had once lived there. The neighborhood around the house continued to thrive. Los Feliz remained one of the most desirable areas in Los Angeles. Property values climbed. Homes were bought and renovated and sold for millions of dollars. Families moved in, raised children, lived normal lives. And in the middle of all this vitality, the Perelson house sat dark and empty, a void in the landscape. Neighbors would walk past it and feel a chill. Real estate agents would avoid showing properties on that block because the presence of the abandoned house would inevitably come up. And once it came up, once the story was told, potential buyers would lose interest. The house had become a liability to the entire street, a reminder of something people did not want to think about. By the 1990s, the house had taken on a different kind of life. It became a legend. Teenagers in Los Angeles whispered about it, dared each other to approach it at night, invented stories about ghosts and curses. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the windows. Others said they heard screaming. None of these stories were true, or at least there was no evidence they were true. But the stories persisted because the house demanded explanation. It was too strange, too disturbing, too present to simply ignore. An abandoned mansion in the middle of a wealthy neighborhood is an anomaly, and people create narratives to make sense of anomalies. So the Perelson house became haunted in the cultural imagination, even if it was not haunted in any literal sense. Urban explorers and true crime enthusiasts began to seek it out. Photographs of the exterior appeared on websites dedicated to Los Angeles history and unsolved mysteries. Some people managed to get inside, though how they gained access is unclear, and they took photographs of the interior. These images circulated online, showing rooms frozen in the past, furniture covered in dust, wallpaper peeling, but still recognizable as a family home. The Christmas presents were reportedly still there, decades old, the wrapping paper faded and torn. The sight of them was deeply unsettling to anyone who understood the context. They were not just old presents. They were presents from a father to a family he had murdered, gifts that represented a future that had been canceled in the most violent way possible. The house was not just a building, it had become a symbol. It represented the hidden darkness in ordinary lives, the way tragedy can strike without warning in places that seem safe and prosperous. It represented the aftermath of violence, the way trauma does not end when the violence ends, but continues in the physical spaces that remain. And it represented a collective inability to move forward, to clean up, to erase. For more than 50 years, no one could bring themselves to truly deal with the Perelson house. It was easier to leave it alone, to let it sit there as a monument to something no one wanted to confront directly. In 2016, the house was finally purchased by someone willing to take on its history. The new owner was a lawyer and flipper who saw past the tragedy to the potential value of the property itself. Los Feliz real estate was worth millions. The house, despite its condition, sat on a desirable lot with good bones. It could be saved. And so the renovation began. The interior was gutted. The furniture was removed. Personal belongings, including the Christmas presents, were finally cleared out after nearly 60 years. The walls were torn down and rebuilt. The floors were refinished. Modern appliances were installed. The house was transformed from a time capsule of 1959 into a contemporary Los Angeles home. It was listed for sale and eventually sold for over $2 million. The renovation erased the physical evidence of what had happened there, but it could not erase the history. The new owners, whoever they are, live in a house where Lillian Perelson was murdered, where Harold Perelson died by his own hand, where Jedi Perelson nearly lost her life. They sleep in rooms where those events took place, even if those rooms look completely different now. And the question that hangs over the house, even in its renovated form, is whether a place can ever truly be cleaned of its past, or whether the past remains embedded in the structure itself, invisible but present, a weight that no amount of new paint can cover. The question that has never been answered and likely never will be is why. Harold Perelson left no manifesto, no confession, no breadcrumb trail of reasoning that might allow us to understand what led him to pick up a hammer and destroy his family. There was no note found at the scene, no letter tucked away in a drawer explaining his state of mind, no journal entries documenting a descent into despair or madness, no voicemail left for a friend or colleague outlining his grievances or delusions. Harold Perelson simply acted, and then he died, and the silence he left behind has been deafening for more than 60 years. In the absence of explanation, people have offered theories. They are educated guesses, attempts to impose some kind of logic on an act that may have had no logic at all. The most commonly cited theory is financial stress. Harold's medical practice was struggling. He was losing patients, losing income, and the lifestyle he had built for his family required money that he no longer had. The mansion in Los Feliz was not cheap to maintain. There were mortgages, bills, expectations. Harold had built his identity around being a successful provider, and that identity was crumbling. Perhaps, the theory goes, he could not face the shame of financial failure. Perhaps he could not bear the thought of his family losing their home, their status, their comfort. And so, in a twisted act of what he might have perceived as mercy, he decided to end everything before the collapse became visible to the outside world. But this theory, while plausible, does not feel complete. Financial stress is common. Doctors lose patients. Practices struggle. People face bankruptcy and foreclosure and professional failure all the time. The vast majority of them do not murder their families. Financial stress might explain despair. It might explain depression, anxiety, even suicidal ideation. But it does not explain the decision to take a hammer to your sleeping wife's head. It does not explain the choice to enter your daughter's bedroom and try to kill her. There is a gap between financial desperation and familial annihilation that cannot be bridged by money problems alone. Another theory involves undiagnosed mental illness. Perhaps Harold Perelson was suffering from a psychotic break, a sudden and severe disconnection from reality that made him believe he was doing something necessary or even protective. Psychosis can manifest in strange ways. It can convince a person that their family is in danger and that killing them is the only way to save them from something worse. It can create delusions so powerful that a person's actions, however horrific, make perfect sense within the distorted logic of their own mind. And it can happen to anyone, even to people who have functioned normally for decades. Even to doctors who understand the mechanics of the human body but not the vulnerabilities of the human mind. But there is no evidence that Harold Perelson was psychotic. No one who knew him reported that he was hearing voices or expressing paranoid delusions or behaving in ways that suggested a break from reality. He was withdrawn. Yes. He was stressed and exhausted. Yes. But he was not raving. He was not incoherent. He continued to see patients, to interact with colleagues, to present himself as a rational, competent professional. If he was experiencing psychosis, it was hidden so completely that even the people closest to him did not detect it. And that level of concealment is possible, but it is rare. Most psychotic breaks are visible, at least in retrospect. There are usually warning signs, moments when the person's grip on reality slips and others notice. With Harold Perelson, those moments, if they existed, went unrecorded. A third theory focuses on the state of Harold and Lillian's marriage. Perhaps there were problems beneath the surface that no one outside the relationship understood. Perhaps there had been affairs, betrayals, conflicts that festered over years. Perhaps Harold felt trapped, resentful, unable to leave but also unable to continue. Perhaps the murder was not the result of a sudden break, but the culmination of years of suppressed rage and frustration. This theory is the hardest to prove or disprove because marriages are private. What happens between two people when no one else is watching is largely unknowable. Friends and neighbors might observe a couple and think they seem happy, or at least functional, but that observation is based on performance. On the face, a couple chooses to show the world. The reality could be entirely different. Lillian had suggested that Harold see a psychiatrist. This fact alone indicates that she saw something wrong. Something serious enough that professional intervention seemed necessary. But what exactly did she see? Was it depression? Anxiety? Anger? Confusion? Did Harold confide in her about thoughts he was having, fears he could not shake, impulses he could not control? Or did she simply notice that he was not himself? That he was distant and unreachable? That the man she had married was slowly disappearing? We do not know. Lillian died without having the chance to explain what she observed or what she feared. And Harold died without confirming or denying any of it. The truth is that none of these theories feel adequate. They are frameworks we use to make sense of senseless acts, but they do not capture the full reality of what happened. Harold Perelson was likely experiencing some combination of financial stress, mental health deterioration, and personal despair. But even that combination does not fully explain why he made the specific choice he made. Plenty of people experience all three of those things and do not become violent. Plenty of people hit rock bottom and find ways to survive without destroying the people around them. What separated Harold Perelson from those people is unknown. Perhaps it was a difference in brain chemistry, a vulnerability that was genetic or developmental. Perhaps it was a specific thought or realization that occurred to him in the days before the murders, something that shifted his perspective in a way that made violence seem not just possible but necessary. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the feeling that he could not continue one more day, and that taking his family with him was, in his fractured thinking, less cruel than leaving them to deal with the aftermath of his suicide. What is clear is that Harold Perelson made a decision. This was not an accident. It was not a momentary lapse. He walked through his house with purpose. He struck his wife multiple times, with enough force to kill her. He entered his daughter's room with the same weapon. This required planning, or at least a commitment that lasted longer than a single impulsive second. He had time to stop. He had time to reconsider. He had time to put the hammer down and walk away. But he did not, he continued. And then, when his children escaped, when the plan fell apart, he turned the violence on himself. He chose death over facing what he had done. He chose silence over explanation. This silence is the most frustrating aspect of the case. It denies us closure. It denies us understanding. It forces us to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of accepting that sometimes terrible things happen for reasons that cannot be fully articulated or understood.
Ow.
We want murders to make sense. We want to be able to point to a clear motive, a logical progression of events that led to violence. We want to believe that if we understand the cause, we can prevent the next tragedy. But the Perelson case resists that comfort. It offers no clear lesson, no obvious warning sign that could have been heeded. It simply happened. And the why remains locked in the mind of a man who has been dead for more than 60 years. The story of the Los Feliz murder-suicide is not just about what happened in 1959, it is about what happens after. When a family is shattered, and the pieces are left for others to interpret, it is about the way a single act of violence ripples outward through time, affecting not just the immediate victims, but generations of people who never, Knew the family, who never set foot in that house, who only encountered the story through whispers and articles and photographs taken decades later. The murders themselves lasted minutes. The aftermath has lasted a lifetime and beyond. Judi Perelson's survival meant she carried the weight of that night for the rest of her life. She was the only member of her immediate family who lived through the attack and remained old enough to remember it with full clarity. Her younger siblings were traumatized, certainly, but they were children. Their memories would be fragmented, incomplete, shaped more by what they were told than by what they actually witnessed. Judi saw everything. She felt the hammer. She looked into her father's face and saw nothing looking back. She ran from the house bleeding and terrified, knowing that her mother was dead and that her father had tried to kill her. That knowledge does not fade. It does not soften with time. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. She changed her name. She moved away. She built a new life with a new identity in a place where no one knew her history. This was not cowardice. This was survival. To remain Judi Perelson was to remain forever. The girl whose father murdered her mother. The girl who barely escaped with her life. The girl defined entirely by one night of horror. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that if she was going to have any chance at a normal life, she had to shed that identity completely. She had to become someone else. And so she did. She married. She had a career. She lived quietly, privately, away from the media attention that periodically flared up around the case. She refused interviews. She declined to participate in documentaries or true crime investigations. She protected herself in the only way she could, by refusing to be a public figure in the story of her own trauma. But the weight was still there. It had to be. You do not survive something like that and simply move on as if it never happened. The trauma was embedded in her body, in her nervous system, in the way she moved through the world. Every time she heard footsteps at night, her body would remember. Every time she saw a father with his daughter, some part of her would remember. The flashbacks, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to fully trust anyone. These are not things that can be willed away. They are the cost of survival. Judi Perelson paid that cost for decades alone, in silence, because that was the only way she knew how to keep living. Her younger siblings were marked by the night as well, though in ways that are harder to trace because they remained even more private than Judi. They were separated after the murders. Placed with different relatives, their childhoods fractured by forces completely beyond their control. They grew up knowing that their father had killed their mother. They grew up without parents, without a stable home, without the basic sense of safety that most children take for granted. They had to construct identities in the shadow of an act they did not commit and could not understand. They had to answer questions throughout their lives about where they came from, about their family, about their childhood. And those answers were impossible to give without revealing a history that most people could not comprehend. The extended family was affected too. Relatives who had known Harold as a brother, a cousin, a nephew, had to reconcile the person they thought they knew with what he had done. They had to grieve Lillian while also grappling with the fact that she had been murdered by her own husband. They had to take in traumatized children and try to provide stability when their own understanding of the world had been upended. They had to manage the estate, deal with the house, handle the practical aftermath of a tragedy, while also processing the emotional devastation. And they had to do all of this while the media attention was still fresh, while reporters were calling, while neighbors were gossiping, while the story was being told and retold in ways that often sensationalized the horror without acknowledging the human cost. The house itself became part of the aftermath. For more than 50 years, it stood as a physical reminder of what had happened. Neighbors who moved onto the street decades after the murders would eventually learn the history. And once they learned it, they could not unknow it. The abandoned mansion became a presence in the neighborhood, a dark spot that people avoided, a conversation topic that came up at dinner parties and community meetings. Children growing up in Los Feliz in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s knew about the Perelson house, even if they did not know the details. It was the creepy house, the haunted house, the house you did not go near after dark. And that reputation, that aura of darkness, was itself a form of ongoing trauma. A way that the violence of 1959 continued to exert influence on people who had not even been born when it happened. The media contributed to the extension of the story. Every few years, a journalist would write a new article about the case. A true crime show would do an episode. A podcast would dedicate multiple installments to examining the evidence and speculating about Harold's motives. Retelling brought the story back into public consciousness, ensured that it would not be forgotten, that the Perelson name would remain associated with murder and tragedy. For some people, this media attention felt like a form of justice, a way of ensuring that Lillian was not forgotten, that what happened to her was acknowledged. But for the survivors, for Jedi and her siblings, it was a violation. It was a reminder that they could never fully escape that, no matter how far they moved or how completely they changed their identities. The story would always be there waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to search. The murder never ended. That is the terrible truth at the center of this story. The actual violence lasted a few minutes on a December night in 1959, but the consequences of that violence extended forward through decades. It continued in Judy's nightmares, in her hypervigilance, in the way she could never fully relax because some part of her was always waiting for the next blow. It continued in her siblings' fractured childhoods, in their struggles to form stable relationships and trust other people. It continued in the abandoned house, in the neighborhood's collective memory. In the stories teenagers told each other to scare themselves. It continued in every article written, every documentary filmed, every podcast episode recorded. The act itself was finite, but the trauma it created was infinite, spreading outward like ripples on water, touching lives that never directly intersected with the Perelson family. This is what violence does. It does not stay contained in the moment of its occurrence. It leaks out into the world and infects everything it touches. It creates secondary victims, tertiary victims, people who suffer because of proximity to suffering. It changes the geography of a neighborhood, the psychology of a family, the texture of a community's collective memory. The Los Feliz murders happened once, but they kept happening, over and over, in the minds and bodies of the people who survived, in the imaginations of people who only knew the story secondhand, in the physical presence of a house that stood empty for half a century because no one could bear to live where such horror had occurred. There is a tendency, when examining cases like this, to search for meaning, to find a lesson or a warning that might prevent the next tragedy. We want to believe that if we study the evidence carefully enough, if we analyze Harold Perelson's life with sufficient thoroughness, we can identify the exact moment when intervention might have made a difference. We want to extract something useful from the horror, some insight that will allow us to protect ourselves and our families from similar fates. We want the story to teach us something, but the Los Feliz murders resist that impulse. They do not offer clarity. They do not provide a neat psychological profile or a moment of realization where everything makes sense. They refuse to be reduced to a cautionary tale with clear takeaways. What they offer instead is something more uncomfortable, something harder to accept. They offer a reminder that some people, even those who seem stable and successful and normal by every visible measure, carry darkness that no one can see until it is too late. Harold Perelson was not a monster in the usual sense. He was not a person with a long history of violence or instability. He was not someone who had shown warning signs that were ignored by negligent friends or family members. He was a doctor, a father, a husband, a member of his community. He went to work. He paid his bills. He attended to his responsibilities. He looked from the outside like thousands of other middle-aged professional men in 1950s America. And then, one night, he became something else entirely. Not gradually, not with a long build-up that everyone could see coming, but suddenly, decisively, with an act of violence so extreme that it obliterated everything that had come before it. This is the terrifying part. Not that Harold Perelson was uniquely evil, but that he was ordinary right up until the moment he was not. The transformation was invisible until it manifested in action. And if it happened to him, if a respected cardiologist with a medical degree and a family and a home in a good neighborhood could cross that line, then the question becomes, how many other people are carrying that same potential? How many other seemingly normal lives are being held together by threads so thin that one moment of additional stress, one bad day, One intrusive thought that takes hold could cause the same catastrophic collapse, and we do not like to think about this. We prefer to believe that violence comes from a certain type of person, that there are predictable patterns, that monsters announce themselves before they act. We want to believe that the man who murders his family is somehow fundamentally different from the rest of us, that there is something we could have seen if we had been paying attention. But Harold Perelson disrupts that comfort. He looked like everyone else. He functioned like everyone else. The darkness was internal, invisible, undetectable. And that means it could be anywhere. It could be in the coworker who seems a little stressed lately. It could be in the neighbor who has been quieter than usual. It could be in the family member who insists everything is fine even when something clearly is not. We have no reliable way to identify these people before they act because they do not identify themselves. They go through the motions of normal life until the moment they stop. The question is not just why it happened, but how often it is happening in homes where no one is watching, where the collapse is slow and invisible until it is sudden and irreversible. How many people right now are experiencing the same internal deterioration that Harold Perelson experienced in the months before the murders? How many are lying awake at night, overwhelmed by financial pressure or depression or a sense that they cannot continue, and thinking thoughts they do not share with anyone? How many are maintaining the facade of normalcy while internally they are disintegrating? We have no way to know. These people do not announce themselves. They do not seek help, often because they do not recognize that they need it, or because the stigma of admitting mental health struggles is too great, or because they have convinced themselves that their suffering is deserved or manageable or temporary. They simply carry it alone in silence until something breaks. And when it breaks, the consequences are often irreversible. Harold Perelson did not just harm himself. He destroyed his wife. He attempted to destroy his children. He left trauma that would echo through generations. One man's internal collapse became a catastrophe that affected dozens of lives directly and thousands more indirectly through the story that spread from it. This is the arithmetic of violence. It does not stay contained. It multiplies. And the tragedy is that in many cases, it might have been preventable if the person suffering had been able to ask for help, or if the people around them had been able to recognize the severity of what was happening. But we do not live in a world where that happens reliably. We live in a world where people hide their struggles, where asking for help is seen as weakness, where mental health care is stigmatized or inaccessible, where the signs of someone drowning are often subtle enough that they are missed until it is too late. Harold Perelson's wife suggested he see a psychiatrist. This is one of the few concrete pieces of evidence we have that someone recognized he was in trouble. But we do not know if he followed that advice. We do not know if he went to an appointment and was turned away, or if he went and was not properly diagnosed, or if he simply refused to go because he could not admit that he needed help. What we know is that whatever intervention might have happened, it was not enough. It did not prevent what came next. And this raises difficult questions about responsibility, about systems, about what we owe each other as members of a society. If someone is clearly struggling, what is our obligation to intervene? And if we do intervene, what tools do we actually have to help them? The mental health system in 1959 was limited, stigmatized, often ineffective. But even today, with better understanding and more resources, people still fall through the cracks. People still suffer in silence until their suffering becomes violence. The Los Feliz murders do not provide answers to these questions. They simply illustrate the stakes. They show what happens when internal collapse meets external pressure, meets isolation, meets a moment of terrible decision. They show the gap between how someone appears and what they are experiencing. They show that respectability, success, education, none of these things protect against the vulnerabilities of the human mind. Harold Perelson had every advantage. He had training, resources, status, and none of it mattered. The darkness found him anyway, or was in him all along, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to surface. There is no comfort in this story. There is no moment where we can say, this is where it went wrong. This is what should have been done differently. This is how we prevent it next time. The variables are too complex. The internal life of another person is too opaque. We can improve systems, reduce stigma, make mental health care more accessible, and those things are worth doing. But they will not eliminate cases like this entirely. because some collapses happen too quickly or too quietly to intercept. Some people will always choose silence over help. Some suffering will always remain invisible until it manifests as harm. What the story does offer is a challenge to our assumptions. It challenges the belief that we can always tell who is dangerous and who is safe. It challenges the idea that tragedy only happens to other people, in other families, in other neighborhoods. It challenges our sense of control, our belief that if we are vigilant enough, if we pay close enough attention, we can protect ourselves and the people we love from senseless violence. The truth is more difficult. The truth is that Harold Perelson was a man who looked like he was managing until the moment he stopped managing entirely. And when that moment came, there was no warning, no opportunity for intervention, no chance to pull him back from the edge. There was only the act itself, and then the long, terrible aftermath. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing. Not because this channel is trying to exploit tragedy, not because we are here to sensationalize suffering, but because these stories matter in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. They matter because they reveal something true about the fragility of the lives we build, about the way normalcy can collapse without warning, about the darkness that exists in places we prefer not to look. The Los Feliz murders are not just a piece of true crime history. They are a window into the human condition at its most vulnerable, most frightening, most incomprehensible. And if we turn away from that window, if we refuse to look because what we see is too disturbing, we lose the opportunity to understand something essential about the world we live in. There are other stories like this, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be told. Stories of families that seemed fine until they were not. Stories of people who functioned in society, who held jobs and maintained relationships and presented themselves as stable, until something inside them broke and the consequences were catastrophic. These stories do not fit neatly into the narratives we prefer. They are not about clear villains and innocent victims. They are not about justice prevailing or lessons learned. They are messy, ambiguous, troubling in ways that resist easy resolution. But that is exactly why they need to be told, because the world is not neat. Human psychology is not predictable. Tragedy does not announce itself with warning labels and clear timelines. It simply happens, often in places where we least expect it, to people who seemed least likely to experience it. This channel exists to examine those stories with the seriousness they deserve. Not to entertain, though. If the storytelling is compelling, that is not a failure. Not to moralize, though the weight of these events naturally invites reflection on how we live and what we owe each other. But primarily to document, to preserve, to ensure that the people who suffered in these tragedies are not forgotten, and that the questions raised by their suffering are not dismissed simply because they are uncomfortable. Lillian Perelson was a real person. She had a life, a history, hopes, and fears and daily routines that were erased in a single night of violence. Judy Perelson survived something that most people cannot imagine surviving, and she spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild an identity separate from that trauma. These are not just characters in a story. They were human beings whose lives intersected with horror, and their experiences deserve to be acknowledged with depth and respect. If there is a case you think deserves attention, a story that has been overlooked or misunderstood or sensationalized in ways that missed the deeper truth, leave it in the comments. This channel is not just about the most famous cases or the most shocking headlines. It is about the stories that reveal something essential about human nature, about society, about the thin line between order and chaos that we all walk without always realizing it. Some of the most important stories are the ones that never became national news, that remained local tragedies known only to the communities they affected. Those stories matter too. They matter because every tragedy, no matter how small its immediate impact, contains within it questions that are universal. Questions about why people hurt each other. Questions about what breaks inside a person before they commit an irreversible act. Questions about how we live with the knowledge that safety is never guaranteed, that the people we trust can become threats, that the homes we build can become places of horror. The Los Feliz case is more than 60 years old, but it has not lost its power to disturb. In some ways, time has made it more disturbing, not less. The fact that the house sat abandoned for half a century, that no one could bring themselves to erase the evidence of what happened there, suggests that some tragedies are too large to simply move past. They demand to be remembered. They demand to be examined. Not because remembering is pleasant, but because forgetting would be a kind of erasure of the people who suffered. To forget Lillian Perelson is to pretend her death did not matter. To forget Jodi's survival is to dismiss the extraordinary courage it took for her to rebuild a life after what she experienced. To forget the case entirely is to lose the opportunity to grapple with the questions it raises about mental health, about family dynamics, about the invisible pressures that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary violence. This is not easy content to engage with. It does not offer the satisfaction of a solved mystery or the comfort of a clear moral, leaves you with questions rather than answers. It forces you to sit with discomfort, with ambiguity, with the recognition that some things cannot be fully understood or neatly resolved. But that discomfort is valuable. It is a reminder that the world is more complex and more dangerous than we usually allow ourselves to acknowledge. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of normal life, there are currents we cannot see, forces we cannot control, vulnerabilities we cannot eliminate, no matter how carefully we try to protect ourselves and the people we love. If you are still watching, if you have made it to the end of this examination of the Perelson case, it suggests that you understand this. You understand that some stories are worth engaging with not because they make us feel good, but because they make us think, because they challenge our assumptions, because they reveal truths that are difficult but necessary to confront. This channel is built for people like you, people who are willing to look at darkness without flinching, who are curious about the hidden mechanisms of human behavior, who want to understand not just what happened in cases like this, but why it matters that we remember them. Subscribing means you will be notified when new stories are published. It means you are choosing to engage with content that treats tragedy with the seriousness it deserves, that does not exploit suffering for cheap thrills, that respects the people involved, even as it examines the horrifying things that happen to them. It means you are part of a community that values depth over spectacle, that asks difficult questions even when the answers are elusive, that believes some stories need to be told even when they are hard to hear. There is no shortage of darkness in the world. There's no shortage of tragedies that remain unexamined, of families destroyed by violence, of lives cut short by people who were supposed to protect them. This channel cannot cover all of them, but it can cover some of them with care, with intelligence, with a commitment to honoring the people who suffered rather than simply using their pain as content. That is the promise. That is what subscribing supports. If that resonates with you, if you see value in this approach, your subscription helps ensure that more of these stories can be told in the way they deserve to be told. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with this story, for giving your attention to something that is difficult and sad and unresolved. Your willingness to sit with that discomfort, to think about what it means to carry these questions forward into your own life, that is what makes this work meaningful. The story of Harold and Lillian Perelson, of Jedi and her siblings, of the house that stood empty for 50 years, does not end here. It continues in the minds of everyone who encounters it, everyone who thinks about it, everyone who asks themselves what they would do if they saw the warning signs in someone they loved. It continues in you. And perhaps that continuation, that ongoing engagement with difficult questions, is the only form of meaning we can extract from tragedies that otherwise offer none.